Welcome, everyone. Bob and I are doing another session of answering your questions, and we're
Yep.
excited for the topic today. We were asked what fantasy authors have been most influential on us as writers, and we decided when we compared our lists, they were very similar. So we decided to do a top five most influential writers, fantasy writers, on us as authors,
Yeah. When we
because it's
work so closely together as authors, so many of the series ended up influencing us both because we would compare notes. So I think it makes sense that we just kind of did it combined, and we'll talk about some of the differences when we get into honorable mentions.
yeah. Uh, so the first one we wanted to mention, number five, if you will, but not because he's the least of the five influential. The
No.
godfather of fantasy, Tolkien, is really, in my case, especially the earliest of the fantasy authors that I read. I read The Hobbit when I was in third grade, the summer between third and fourth grade, and I had read The Wizard of Oz before, and some very elementary fantasy type stories, but Tolkien's The Hobbit was really the first introduction to me to a complete, robust fantasy world, and I fell in love with fantasy. After that, during fourth grade, I ended up getting into playing Dungeons and Dragons, and just loved the entire fantasy genre. Like my soul just sang with the joy of fantasy. And even that summer, after I read The Hobbit, I was like, I need to write my own fantasy story. Like I was just so engrossed in it. I started writing, and I got about 10 pages of a handwritten novel that was basically just plagiarism of Tolkien, and had my mom type it up, and it came out to a whopping 2 pages of content. And I was so
Ooh.
discouraged as a writer. I was like, "Oh my gosh, how much am I going to have to write?" Little did I know that it was going to be, you know,
Yeah.
many,
Exactly.
many, many, many multiples of that I my writing journey had ahead of me. But the themes that Tolkien tackled, and the world building that he did, and the fantasy races with dwarves and elves and orcs, and the magic that he had in the world, all of those elements were really exciting and fantastical, captured my
Yeah.
imagination. But Tolkien also uh, dealt with themes of heroism, loyalty, uh, self-sacrifice that really spoke to my soul. And I've always wanted what I responded to the most, both as a reader and then especially as a writer, for me was wanting to tell stories that gave people exposure to those same ideas in ways that resonated with me.
Oh yeah. The themes that he wrote on it, and I especially like some of his portrayals of Aragorn. I thought were just beautiful. I got into Tolkien late. I got into to fantasy via other means, and then of course everybody tells you you have to read Tolkien. I mean, you just have to. That's part of being a fantasy fan. And being the rebellious youth that I was, I said no, I don't. And so I put it off. I uh, I tried my best to resist
Blasphemy.
the lure of Tolkien, and alas, they were coming out with these little movies that they were making, and I thought, okay, I can't
You're
watch
talking about
Tolkien
the
before I
70s
read Tolkien.
cartoons, right?
Yeah, maybe not. I, I got to where I saw Peter Jackson stuff, and it looked like it was going to be good, maybe, but I hadn't really read the books, and I decided, okay, I got to sit down and read this, and I did, and I was a little bit worried that everybody had built up Tolkien as this monolithic, just titan in the industry, and of course he can't measure up, and yeah, he does.
Yeah.
The work that he did was the scope and the breadth of his writing was just spectacular. So I got introduced to Tolkien through Lord of the Rings, and it was everything I hoped it would be, and it was funny because as I'm reading this, I was thinking it's a little tropey, but it's not. It's good. And then I realized it's only tropey because he did it first. We would not have a
It's
fantasy
where all the
genre.
tropes come from.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
So in many ways, I think of him as in yeah, Casablanca. When you watch Casablanca and you go, man, every line in this movie is kind of cliche. Yeah, it's cliche because this movie was great and it kicked off these lines into our lexicon. Tolkien was a lot like that to me. In fact, when I read The Hobbit, I was a little bit disappointed because I had read Lord of the Rings first, and I was
Yeah.
expecting more along that line. And it was a children's book, but it's a great introduction into fantasy. And that kind of leads us right into our next one on our list. And number 4 for us is the Dragonlance series.
Yeah.
So
Amazing.
when you got introduced to fantasy through The Hobbit, I got introduced to fantasy through Dragonlance, and I played D&D with my cousins and then with my family and some friends, and I got introduced to the concepts of fantasy. But when Dragonlance came out, I was still a young and formative young man, and Dragonlance was just breathtaking. I loved the characters. I loved the portrayal of this new world that I got to know. Margaret Weiss and Tracy Hickman, they did just a spectacular job of capturing the spirit of fantasy as I knew it as a young man and putting it on paper. And the reason that Dragonlance is so high on our list, especially for me, I think I probably would have put it higher than you, is that um, when I read Dragonlance, it was the first work that I thought, oh, I I could write stories. I could tell these kinds of stories. I can't write like Margaret Weiss and Tracy Hickman, but they have put together a story like I pictured in my head. Maybe if I get better, I can do that for somebody else. And so for me, Dragonlance was really the gateway drug into fantasy. It was what got me into writing and really inspired me to be a writer. If Dragonlance had not existed, I don't know if I would have followed the same path. I owe a lot of gratitude to Margaret Weiss and Tracy Hickman.
Yeah. Uh, so you were the one who introduced me to Dragonlance, and I had just moved to Alaska, and I felt that I was moving into outer darkness. I mean, literally. And
It
so,
makes
by
sense.
the time we were hitting
Yep.
winter, and it was dark all the time. But I felt like I had no friends. I didn't fit in. I was in that awkward, junior high phase. I was the new kid, and you, being a year older than I was, sort of took me under your wing, and you gave me Dragons of Autumn Twilight as a Christmas gift, which was the first time I'd ever had a friend give me a Christmas present. And it meant a lot to me. So when I was reading it, not only was I enjoying it for the fantasy, but
Yeah.
it meant a lot to me emotionally to know that I was reading something that another person cared enough to, share something that you loved with me meant a
Yeah.
lot. And that
It
sort
sounds
of,
like it was a nice philanthropic thing for me to do, but in reality, I desperately needed somebody to talk to about Dragonlance,
oh
and so
man, and
pawning
did
it
we
off on
talk?
you gave it gave me finally a partner that I could chat about this stuff. It was great.
Yeah, over
I
the
was so glad you liked it.
over the years, as more of those books came out and as we started playing D&D together, we would take long walks in the woods just nerding out, imagining
Oh yes.
fantastical scenarios, and sometimes we'd pretend that there were bad guys attacking us, and we'd grab sticks and fight off the trees or whatever. I don't know. It was a time when our imaginations not only were alive in our own right, but we started bonding
Yeah.
through talking about fantasy and fantasy stories and the Dragonlance series. And one of the things, I, as an adult, I've gone back to read uh, at least Dragons of Autumn Twilight, the first book in the series. And while there are parts of it that are definitely written for maybe a middle grade young adult audience, I mean, it's a
Hmm.
little on the more simplistic side. The magic user casts Featherfall in
Right.
the book, and I mean, that's cool enough when you're a new fantasy nerd and learning things, but it's not the most sophisticated fantasy. but it is very sophisticated when it comes to talking about the characters. So, like Tanis Half-Elven
Yeah.
deals with feelings of being an outsider and not really accepted by either his mother's people or his father's people. And rather than turning bitter, he becomes a servant. He wants to fit in and take care of people and take care of his friends, and becomes a great leader in part because of the difficulty that he's had not fitting in. And the ability to tackle complex emotional stories and character narratives, even in a relatively maybe simplistic or fantasy setting, made me realize how amazing and how moving reading stories could be, but also telling stories. And so Dragonlance really catapulted my understanding of what types of stories I was interested in telling.
Now, out of curiosity, Todd, do you have a favorite character from Dragonlance?
So I would have to say probably Caraman is my favorite.
Oh,
Um,
nice.
and that's changed. Originally, Raceland was my favorite because he was cool and
Right.
had magic, and he was becoming a god. Sorry, slight spoiler alert. Eventually, but and so as a young fantasy nerd, I was like, oh, Raceland, man, the power arc that
Yeah.
he was on, he was my favorite. But as an adult, his brother Caraman is my favorite because Caraman
Yeah.
stayed loyal to Raceland and was willing to allow himself to be sacrificed, knowing that Raceland was taking advantage of him. He never let it stop him from being true to who he was, which was a faithful, loyal brother, and
Yeah.
using his physical strength. And so Caraman is one of the most noble characters I think that there is in how loyal he was willing to be. And maybe he didn't set the most healthy boundaries from a psychological standpoint,
I think there's an argument to be made there.
but for a young man trying to figure out where his place was in the world and how to relate to other people, Caraman, you could do a lot worse than being
Yeah.
someone who's loyal like Caraman.
Yeah, I actually really liked his story arc and grew to like him more and more as the stories went on.
How about
For
yourself?
me, Tass was probably my favorite to read just because he was fun.
He
But
was fun.
Sturm Brightblade was my favorite. Actually, from almost from the very beginning. I liked his nobility. He believed in a higher cause. And then when he found out that the order that he had propped up on a pedestal was not what he thought it was anymore, he still came to grips with the fact that I still believe in these principles, and he stuck by his principles. And I won't spoil it for those that haven't read it after 40 years, but but yeah, I loved his character arc, and I really found there was a lot to admire in him from the very beginning. So he's always been my favorite.
Yeah, yeah, great. All right, so number 3 on our list is Patrick Rothfuss with his Kingkiller Chronicles. The Name of the Wind is book 1,
Yeah.
and you and I have talked about this so many times. Pat's writing is phenomenally beautiful. I mean, his artistry, his poetry, the yes. quality of his prose is just breathtaking. It's so delicious. You can sink your teeth into the writing. And he wrote The Name of the Wind when he was in his early 20s, like 21, 22, like something like that. And my gosh, just the quality of him as a writer made me realize how I wanted not just to tell the stories, but how to make the prose that I was writing beautiful as well. The only other writer that I can think of who's ever made me love language and the combination of language that much is Shakespeare, right? Mm-hmm. Like so many Shakespeare plays and his poetry are just so beautiful. I was about to start quoting Henry V. Like there's so many parts of of Shakespeare's work that just the language make, oh,
Yeah.
for a muse of fire. Like I just, oh, it's just beautiful. It makes me love the language itself to see how beautifully it can be crafted. And
But I
Rothfuss
think
does that for me.
oh yeah, he's right there. In fact, I've actually shown the opening to Name of the Wind to several friends and family members, and just when you get towards the end of that list, and they're talking about the three silences, and when it closes with the cut flower sound of a man who is waiting to die, I his phrasing, the prose, it's so beautiful, and I find there's nobody better at the art of writing in any genre that I've read than
Yeah.
Patrick Rothfuss.
The-
I think he's spectacular, and it is a little discouraging
that's what I was
because
going to say.
yeah,
We
when
will
we both
never
read
be that good. We will
no,
never be. I mean, I just know
nope.
it. We will never be that good at
But
our prose.
I did find it funny because as we were writing, and I read Rothfuss, and yeah, there's that side of you that goes, oh, geez, I can't do this. But it did make me change, and I started looking at, okay, how am I writing? At that point in my writing, I was still trying to uh, give the reader as accurate of a description as possible of what I pictured in my head, and instead,
Yeah.
what I learned from Rothfuss is sometimes it's more important to give them the imagery and the feeling without having to spell it out directly. And in fact, sometimes the way you say things is more important than what you say. And I started looking at my writing very differently, and I think that changed both of us in how we approach the craft of writing.
Yeah. Yeah. I totally agree.
Yeah. So after Rothfuss, for our number two, both of us put George R. R. Martin in the Game of Thrones series, A Song of Ice and Fire. And for me, uh, what I loved most about reading Martin for the first time was the pacing. I started his book, and I swear I put it down sometime about 4 hours later. It was one of those where I wanted to try it out, but the way he wrote, things started to progress so quickly right off the bat, and it seemed like every chapter ended with something that hooked me into starting the next chapter. And I'll just go a little ways into the next chapter, and before I knew it, I had finished that chapter, and there was a hook to go just a little ways into the next chapter. And Martin, what he did with the world he created and all of the characters, the politics, the intrigue behind the scenes, but mostly for the pacing and the way he wrote, I just found him fascinating. And I think the biggest selling point for Martin is when I got to the end of book one, and something happened, and of course it was full of
Spoilers.
spoilers now, but it was just so frustrating that I ended up throwing the book aside when I had finished that scene, and I didn't want to read anymore. And I kind of stewed for about 10 or 15 minutes. And then I came to the realization, if I have this strong of an emotional reaction, that's great writing. So I really
Yeah.
appreciated him for the way he wrote, the pacing, but also the emotional weight that he carried with his writing.
Yeah, I was depressed for 2 days before I came to the realization, like if he can do this for, if he can make me
Yeah.
depressed for 2 days, that is just so powerful to be able to carry. And we were already, um, so I was in my first year of law school when I was reading it, and for me it was, my reward for doing a good job at school. Like I'd
Oh,
do my homework and then I'd be like, okay, now I can read uh,
your
Game of
reward is to
Thrones.
get depressed for 2 days.
Yeah. I didn't know that was going to be the reward, but he made writing so much fun, as I later came to learn about him as a writer, he developed his writing chops in Hollywood slash
Yeah.
TV. And he wrote in the 80s for one of the shows that I loved in the 80s, which was Beauty and the Beast. Ron Perlman
Oh yeah.
plays Vincent, this character that is kind of a lion man, so kind of a fantastical creature, but set in modern day New York. And Linda Hamilton played, sort of a streetwise cop detective, but Vincent helps her from the shadows, but the way that series worked, and most series, every episode has its own story arc within it, that you get,
Yeah.
a 3-act play or a 3-act story within that episode. But then there's also parts of the story that tie into a higher story arc that lasts across the whole season or multiple seasons. And his work on that show and developing as a writer and being able to bring that to bear in a novel, so that when you read a chapter, that chapter has a sense of completeness to it, but that hooks you as it ties into the greater story, and you're like, oh my goodness, I need to read what comes next. He is a master at that pacing, that sense of a sort of instant gratification as you read the individual chapters, but also a desire to stay hooked into the larger story and see where it's going. And
Yes.
you and I, when we were writing, when we finished our first draft and went back and started editing, we realized, oh my gosh, there is some garbage in here that just needs to be cut out. Like, it was boring and no interest, and I was like, if I can't even stand to read this ourselves, uh, no reader is going to want to read this. And we've cut that out. I think, we had to do massive rewrites and study the art of writing.
Yeah.
And I was so often comparing what we would write back against Martin's work to say, am I making this as engaging, as hooking as Martin's work? And, in some ways, like Rothfuss, we'll never get as good as his prose is.
No, I agree.
I think in Martin's case, we'll never probably be as good at pacing as he is. I think we've come a long ways towards the type of pacing that he has. I think our prose has improved a lot. So if we can be 70% of Martin's quality in pacing and 70% of Rothfuss in his prose, and then we'll talk about world building in a minute. But if we can get 70% of that, I think we'll be doing very well. And we've grown a lot as writers. We have more growing to do, and I'm excited for where we're going in books 2 and subsequent. But
agreed.
His writing can't be overstated.
I think the other thing that he did really well, as well as anybody else we've talked about so far, is stakes. And outlining the stakes and making you understand what was at stake with every decision the characters made. And I loved that about him as well. That's another thing that we looked at our own story and said, okay, we need to make this clear. We need to up the stakes here. We need to add personal stakes to these decisions, because otherwise they're just plot decisions. Martin was a master at those things.
Just a brief interruption to let you know that our new book, The Storm Beneath the Glass, will be available April 8th, and we'll leave links down below where you can find it on Amazon or on our website. Now we'll get back to the content. So honorable mentions.
Yeah. You want to go first?
So I would say that honorable mention, did I get a visitor?
You did, but that's okay. Tell her we love her.
Anyway, yeah. Oh, is it Angela? So honorable mention number 1, I think, needs to be Brandon Sanderson, right? Yeah. I mean, we could almost say that he made the list itself, but my exposure to Brandon's writing is somewhat more limited than some of those other authors. But I've been reading the Stormlight Archive, but I've listened to Brandon's writing course that on YouTube that he teaches at Brigham Young University.
Oh, those are great. Those are a great resource for any author out there. Somebody that wants to learn.
Anyone, yeah, so great. But in particular, I think the thing that probably Brandon's work has had the biggest impact on us as a writer is in the I don't know if he's the one who came up with this classification, but he certainly embodied one end of that spectrum and is really good at teaching and explaining it, and that's hard versus soft magic systems. So
Tolkien, absolutely.
Tolkien was a master of soft magic. You
Hmm.
have no idea how Gandalf is able to perform the magic that he's able to perform. He just does fantastical things, magical things that leaves you feeling a sense of awe and wonder. And his traveling companions, the Fellowship, when they see Gandalf do these amazing things, or in The Hobbit when you see him do these cool things,
Hmm.
you're like, yeah, that's really cool. But you have no idea how he did it, what the basis was. You don't know that he's, an angelic being. And even now,
Right.
I still can't say that I really fully understand in what way his Maya angelic
Right.
power translates into the magic that we see him performing.
No, and you don't
And
know what the limits are that he could do. You know that
yeah,
there are some, but he always
or
seems
you
to do
suspect it.
just
Yeah,
enough to be able
just
to hold
enough.
off the Balrog,
Yeah,
or whatever the case
or
is.
whoever. Yeah.
Yep.
Brandon's the other end of that spectrum, right? Like he has
Yeah.
very specific rules, very limits. What are the costs of your magic system? And then his brilliance comes out in the way that his characters play within those very strict, narrow
Mm,
rules.
yep.
The Allomancy rules or the Stormlight and what it can do. With the bindings, just amazing, amazing work as a writer to put boundaries around yourself, and then it frees you up to do the most creative things you can imagine. And so you and I, when we were writing, we were much more on the Tolkien end of things. We wanted some magic things to happen, and so
Right.
we just wrote it that it happened with no
Because it's
basis
cool.
because it's cool. We were like, we could use a fireball here. Let's put that in or whatever. And but then Brandon's explanation and the way he exemplified having a hard magic system in his world really made us discipline ourselves to fully develop both the natural magic system, the divine magic system, how they interface. What are the limits? What are the costs? Really useful in our case, and we're not as I would either say strict or as narrow in the
Hmm.
way that we set up the rules for our magic systems. We decided that we wanted them to feel complex, like physics or whatever. Like it's they're very robust and have complex rules. We understand a lot more than we show in the books, and so it sort of is somewhere in between a hard and a soft magic system. It's a blend of the two. And that was very intentional. We made some decisions, and where the story arc for some of the characters in their power escalation is going. We're all very
Yeah.
conscientious. Hopefully, it works for the readers. We'll see. But yeah, Brendan's been a huge influence on us.
Yeah, and he's not entirely off the list, but the other honorable mention that we wanted to give is Scott Lynch, The Lies of Locke Lamora, and the Gentleman Bastard series in general. And I remember reading this one when I was in the middle of I think our third draft of book one, and I was blown away. Not only is he a talented writer, and I loved his prose, he developed a beautiful world that was very unique. In many ways, it is a fantasy heist story, and it really well done and well crafted. But what I loved most about his work was the relationships that he portrayed. The two main characters, and really the small brotherhood that the first book centers on. You just got a feel for their relationships between each other. It felt visceral when some of them were lost. You felt the pain of that loss. It was shocking. It elicited that same kind of emotional response that I got when I read Martin, and he did such a phenomenal job of showing the interpersonal dynamics between all of the characters. And I remember looking at it going, you know what, I have archetypes in my head. I've got characters, but I don't know that I've really helped the reader see and feel those relationships as well. And it changed the way I approached each of the characters and the interpersonal dynamics between characters as I approach my own writing. I think Scott Lynch, his work on that series was phenomenal.
Yeah,
Moving into our oh yes,
go ahead.
I was just going to say, moving into our final one, number one on our list, is the Wheel of Time by Robert Jordan, the series that he created. And that's why I say Brandon Sanderson wasn't entirely off the list, because even though Robert Jordan created this and wrote the majority of it, Brandon Sanderson finished it with the tragic passing of Robert Jordan before the series could be completed. When I read The Wheel of Time and delved into that world, I was just blown away. Uh, I I had read a lot of fantasy by then, and I thought I knew what fantasy was and world building was. And Tolkien, for instance, did such a great job of building Middle Earth and helping you understand the culture of the elves and the hobbits and the dwarves. But when I got into Robert Jordan's world with the Wheel of Time, I was blown away. I mean, this was a world I had never seen. The world building on a scale that I'd never seen. The different places that you went to. Almost every book featured a new location that the characters would go to, and you got to learn people from this place, and they looked different, and they talked a little bit different, but they acted different. They had different morals, different values behind them. They had different cultures, different ways of dress, different cuisine, different architecture. I mean, everything felt like such a unique and beautiful culture. As you went through his world, you got to know the peoples of his world, and that was that was such a monumental thing for me to recognize. Was what a great world builder he was.
Well, and it's a two-edged sword with him
It
too.
is.
I mean,
Oh yeah.
and with Tolkien, it's interesting because Tolkien's world felt extremely deep and real and lived in,
Yes.
and maybe mysterious, because he didn't describe everything. Right in the Lord of the Rings, you don't know all the mythology. You don't know who the
No,
Maya
not at
are.
all.
They never get mentioned at all. So in Tolkien's novels, you don't get to know all of that stuff. It isn't until his son Christopher pulled all of that together.
Mm-hmm.
They developed the Silmarillion and the Lost Books of Tolkien, and the letters of Tolkien that Christopher compiled and made available to the world, that we began to see the mythology and the world building, the depth that Tolkien had spent years and years developing, that made the world feel real while you were reading it, but also wasn't explicit. It was
Right.
implicit. Whereas Jordan was explicit. He
Yes.
showed you every detail of every, what did the
To a
fruit
fault at
taste like,
times.
to a fault at times. It slowed things down
Yeah.
sometimes. And, as between you and me, this is one of the things that we also get often asked is what are the differences between the two of us in writing, and how do we
Yeah.
sync between, how do we gel our two writing styles together? You love the Jordan-esque
I do.
writing style
You
of,
keep me from going down that path entirely.
but in uh, the Storm Beneath the Glass, in I think it's chapter 1, um, Prince Andric goes out to the stables to get his horse to go right into town because he's got to go take care of something. And uh, in describing the stables, the architecture of the royal stables, there are a couple of paragraphs about the history and that the kings imported into Romalia
Yeah.
people
Someday
from.
I will release the 10 pages I wrote about the history of those stables.
Bob went
And
on
oh
for
yeah.
pages about the royal stables, and I had to cut in the editing. But I have the opposite problem. I get bored if I have to, write what clothes someone has or what food they're eating or what things smell like, and I end up showing rather than telling way more than I should. And Bob, sometimes I'll just put in brackets like describe, and then I'll go on, and
Yeah.
then Bob will go on for 2 pages, and I'll cut it down to a paragraph. So between the two of us, with you following in Jordan's footsteps to make the world
Yes.
feel believed and developed and realistic, and then me hopefully paring it down so it doesn't get too boring. We find that sweet spot. Not every reader will find wherever we land. We'll never be able
Right.
to please all readers.
No, but I hope we found a good balance, and as a result of seeing what Jordan did and learning
Yeah.
from him, I hope we've been able to get a good balance there. Another thing that I loved about Jordan was, and this is partly because of the length that Robert Jordan wrote, but the character development.
Yeah,
My
phenomenal.
favorite storyline was Perrin's storyline in the Wheel of Time, and I think it was about book 5 when he goes back home to the Two Rivers for the first time. They've been away for so long; it's been 5,000 pages of writing, and when he finally gets back, he's a different character, but you've seen him steadily grow and change. And the people that he goes back to haven't seen that change, and they're shocked. But as a reader, you saw that slow character development. So when he gets back, you knew he was different. And it was natural that he would take a different role than the one he left. And I just loved that. I loved the fact that he took his time to show the character slowly evolving and changing into something different and something new. Rather than doing it by leaps and bounds, you got to see a natural progression, and it felt genuine and real.
Well, and the other thing that he did that for me built on what we talked about when I was reading in Dragonlance with the
Yeah.
complexity of the characters, but the characters' personalities, that their maturation didn't really change too much. Like Tanis, as an example, for the most part, or Raceland or Caraman or the various characters, Teak, didn't change dramatically. And they were archetypal characters in themselves, and
Mm-hmm.
they had some complexity to them, but they didn't go through significant arcs, and there wasn't a lot of morally gray area to their characters. Like Raceland just stayed who Raceland was from the beginning,
Right.
right? And you got to watch his power arc progress, and he learned some lessons, and had some of his rough edges tested and maybe rubbed off. But in Jordan's work in the Wheel of Time, uh, and go just before I get there, Tolkien also wrote archetypal characters, right? Like
Mm-hmm. Yes,
um,
he did.
Gimli as a dwarf, the stout, stalwart, never changing, a little bit rough, gruff, offensive sometimes, but, tried and true. He was the archetypal dwarf in Tolkien's world and in fantasy for, decades after. Uh, And
Mm-hmm.
and you could say the same thing about each of the characters. They fit an archetype, and they never really stray too far outside that archetype. And Tolkien's world is very simplistic in the sense, morally speaking, in the sense of there is good, and there
Yeah.
is clear evil, and very rarely do they overlap or switch. Whereas in the Wheel of Time, Jordan was masterful at showing the characters in situations where there was no clear moral answer, and they were solving for multiple
Mm-hmm.
variables in trying to set priorities and balance. And sometimes they got it right, and sometimes it didn't work out how they intended. Not that you would say, oh, well, they made a bad choice or an evil choice. They made the best choice they could at the time. And the world is complex, and things you can't control all the variables, and sometimes things go squirrely. And
Yeah.
seeing a story that evolves through this complexity, and without the clarity, the moral clarity of every decision is obviously either a right one or a wrong one, was really fascinating to me. And then by the time we get to uh, Martin's work, now he's moving into grimdark, right? Like
Right.
everyone is mostly evil and does
Yeah.
terrible things to each other, and the world is propelled forward by horrendous acts of betrayal and
Yeah. There are only shades of
abuse. And
gray all the way down to black.
yeah, exactly. And I like that. I mean, there are evil characters. I mean, there's evil in Jordan's world, no doubt. There's the
Sure.
Trollocs and the Forsaken and the Dark One himself, the Dark Lord, for sure. But in the characters, the main characters, the protagonists, they in, inhabit a much more nuanced, complex space that really allowed me, as a young adult reader,
Mm-hmm.
going through my own growth in that respect, to confront how would I deal with this. And our characters, I think, we, especially as we grew as writers and were rewriting, We were like, we
Yeah.
need to give these characters more agency, more opportunity to try to tackle some of these morally challenging and gray questions in life. So
Yep.
yeah, phenomenal.
I, yeah, I can't. I mean, it is astounding to me just how much influence he's had on my own writing. I look at it and it's not even that close. Jordan was the biggest influence on the kind of writer I became today.
Yeah.
So, so these are our top five, and with a couple of honorable mentions as we've presented them. This is just the ones that have been most influential to us, not the ones we feel have been most influential in the world or in the genre as a whole. But we'd be curious if you've lasted this long in the video. We'd like to know, what is your most influential fantasy writer? What works did you think maybe would have made it on your list that we didn't have on ours? Would be very curious to find out what you guys think. So let us know in the comments below. We appreciate you listening and being with us this long. Love to talk to you guys soon, and we look forward to more of these conversations.